All right, guys, so today we're going to unravel, let's try to lift the veil of mystery from this collection of missiles that Iran has been using in the war against the United States and Israel. Okay, we know that Iran's missiles are the main way the country is staying in the fight right now, right? In other words, Iran uses a huge number of missiles, which are complemented by drones, okay, and also some cruise missiles. But I'm going to focus here on ballistic missiles because they're really the most effective ones in the Iranian arsenal, right? And it's really curious how Iran came to have such a vast arsenal of ballistic missiles, right? Considering that until not long ago, relatively speaking, let's say 50 years ago, the country had no tradition at all of pursuing aerospace engineering of any kind, right? So, missiles are a new phenomenon in relation to Iran's history, but I believe I can explain to you here in a few minutes how this happened. First, you have to understand what a ballistic missile is, right? A ballistic missile means that it has a ballistic trajectory, that parabolic trajectory, right? In other words, it's a missile that's launched vertically or almost vertically, and it will also hit its target vertically. So this missile is considered a ballistic missile. It follows that parabolic path and reaches the target, okay? Unlike cruise missiles, which are missiles that have little wings, right? They resemble small aircraft. So these cruise missiles fly at a lower speed, are usually launched horizontally, but they can also be launched vertically, and they generally hit their target horizontally. In horizontal flight, they actually fly kind of like an aircraft that will crash into the target. That's how it works. For example, the American Tomahawks. But the question about the Iranian ballistic missile, where does it come from? Where does such a large quantity come from, right? This strong development of ballistic missiles for Iran. Do you remember those who have seen my video here about the Iran-Iraq war, which actually is not just one video, it's two, right? Part one, part two. It explains how the conflict between Iran and Iraq happened in the 1980s, right? I would even say more between Iraq and Iran, because the one who really attacked was Iraq. We can see there that Iraq, even if it didn't have a slightly satisfactory level, at least of effectiveness, on the battlefield, Iraq was basically supplied by the entire world, while Iran was supplied by almost no one. Okay, so even though both sides used really obsolete military tactics on the battlefield, with Iran even using human wave attacks, right? That huge number of people just running towards enemy machine gun positions, right? We could see that Saddam Hussein, the commander of the Iraqi forces, managed to maintain very good relations during this period with the Americans, with the United States, with Europe, and also with the Soviet Union. Man, so after the first clashes in the war, Saddam Hussein's arsenal was completely renewed with Soviet equipment, right? But also with a lot of American money, a lot of European money. Why? Because the new Islamic Republic of Iran was an enemy of the world. Ayatollah Khomeini, he had declared that basically the whole world was the target of the regime, right? Who were the great Satans? Who were the great Satans in the view of Ayatollah Khomeini? The United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the two great superpowers. The new Iranian state, see if you understand this, declared a holy war against these two great powers. So when Iran went to war, it found itself practically isolated. So right after the war started, right? And the complete standstill of the front line there, with many casualties, Iran was slowly able to find an external arms supplier. And that supplier was none other than Gaddafi, right? Colonel Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya, who provided the Iranians with a batch, an initial lot of Soviet R-17 Scud ballistic missiles Yeah, the same missiles that Saddam used to buy directly from the Soviet Union, right? In this case, these Soviet missiles reached Iran, being passed on through Libya. So, when these missiles arrive in Iran, the Iranians start using them. Because the Iranian Air Force and the Iraqi Air Force were also too worn out, neither of them was really able to carry out major air strikes. So the two powers started exchanging missiles in the so-called War of the Cities, right? The bombings of the cities, both in Iraq and in Iran, over there in Iran, then they realized. The regime's leadership realized that it was necessary to nationalize these missiles. Why? Well, life? Life? We've managed to get a batch of shields now, but we're going to get more. What if there's a blockade? So we have to nationalize this as soon as possible. While Saddam Hussein, for example, wasn't in such a hurry, in Iran, this happened. So already at the end of the 80s, in the second half of the 80s, it reached the battlefield. In the first versions of the national missiles, these national missiles were named Shahab-One. This was the Shahab-One, which was a short-range ballistic missile. So now we are going to start to understand the progression of these missiles based on this criterion. So about range, okay. So it's good for you to understand the three main concepts of ballistic missile range. The first one is short-range missile or short-range ballistic missile, right? Short-range ballistic missile is the one with the shortest range from about 300 kilometers up to 1,000 kilometers. And then after that, you have the medium-range ballistic missile or medium-range ballistic missile medium range, which goes from 1,000 up to about 3,000 kilometers. You can consider that medium range. Above that, you're talking about the intercontinental ballistic missile, which Iran, up to now, doesn't have any, okay? So we're going to talk specifically about the short-range ballistic missile and the medium-range ballistic missile then. The Shahab-One short-range ballistic missile had a range of about 330 kilometers, capable of carrying a 1,000-kilogram warhead with an accuracy of 450 meters. Since it was essentially a copy of the Soviet Scud, it had liquid propulsion, okay? And liquid propulsion has some advantages, but it has several disadvantages when it comes to missile operation, right? When you want to launch a satellite into space, liquid propulsion is excellent because it allows better control of the rocket's direction, right? In other words, you can insert the satellite into a very precise orbit. With liquid propulsion, however, liquid propulsion requires a long preparation time, and depending on the situation, it can be too long. In other words, a ballistic missile with liquid propulsion has to be fueled, literally fueled, just like your car. It has to be fueled with fuel that can even be cryogenic, right? Stored below 0 degrees temperature to keep some substances in a liquid state, okay? These missiles can be difficult to arm and launch in an operational situation, like a war, for example. So that's what Iran started, right? With that, they made an exact copy of the Soviet Shield. But soon after, they also made a partnership with another state that was an international pariah. Though it was communist, it had split from the Soviet Union and was no longer its partner. That was North Korea at the time, right? North Korea was communist and Stalinist, so after Khrushchev's reforms, they kind of drifted apart. So the Iranians went to get knowledge from the North Koreans who passed it on to them. So the Hwasong-6 project, a North Korean missile, which was also kind of a copy of the Scud, right? But this is the North Korean version. It had a range. It had been optimized to have a greater range, but for you to have a greater range. The North Koreans sacrificed the payload, right? They sacrificed the warhead, reduced the power of the warhead. So Even though the range of the Shahab-2, this new Iranian short-range ballistic missile, reached 500 kilometers instead of the previous 330, it could only carry a 770-kilogram warhead, which means a loss of about 22% in destructive power. But it reached, right? A greater distance, and its accuracy remained more or less the same, right? 450, 500 meters of accuracy. Okay, and now, guys, another thing we have to take into consideration here are these three parameters: range, warhead, and accuracy, right? Because you can't always manage to increase all three at the same time. So when you try to increase two, you sacrifice one of them. And we're going to see a lot of that here. In other words, a missile might have greater range but a smaller warhead with more accuracy. Or it might have more destructive power with more accuracy but less range. Got it? So here's the thing. Once the Shahab-1 and Shahab-2 back in the 90s were already operational, but they were essentially copies of the Scud, still Soviet, right? At the end of the 90s, the Khorramshahr was created. The Khorramshahr is also a short-range ballistic missile, right? But with a much improved range, right? Or is it an improvement made by the Iranian group of engineers themselves, by Iranian missile engineers who managed to modify it there? The missile's engineering to increase its range to 800 kilometers, and this new missile then carried an unchanged warhead, right, of 750 kilos there. As I told you, you can increase the range, but you sacrifice the destructive payload, and you can also increase the accuracy, right? You can't always increase all three at the same time. So the Khorramshahr, it could reach 800 kilometers with a 750 kilo warhead, but with much better accuracy. 100 meters instead of the previous 500 meters, right? Also using liquid propulsion. Okay, guys, Iran still hadn't mastered solid propulsion. And this Khorramshahr, as I told you, is an improvement over the Shahab-2, but it had, right? It has because it's still active. It also has a structural improvement, which is the ability for the warhead to detach from the main body. That's why it achieves such greater accuracy. Because the only part that actually survives re-entry into Earth's atmosphere is the missile's warhead, the missile's body. It starts to disintegrate because the material can't withstand the forces of re-entry. But in this process of re-entry, that intense shaking of the missile's body can add inaccuracy to the warhead's trajectory. Do you understand? It's like the warhead is here, see? And the missile is shaking back here. And that increases the missile's inaccuracy. Since the warhead separates from the missile's body, it can increase its accuracy. And that's what makes the Khorramshahr more valuable than the Shahab-2 for the Iranians. Okay. So now we're getting into it, man. We're still going to talk about some short-range missiles, all right? But I'm going to use a logic here, which is the logic of family evolution, of design, missile families. So we're going to continue with this first missile family, Shahab here, up to its latest and most modern member. Then I'll move on to the next one, okay? So let's go. So we have the development of the Shahab-3, the Shahab-3. Man, it's no longer that Scud missile, okay? It's not the Soviet Scud with a North Korean version and then an Iranian version. No, it's a version of the North Korean Nodong-1A. It's already a different missile, okay? And this other missile with a range greater than 1,300 kilometers is already introduced. As you may have already noticed, the Shahab-3 falls into the category of medium-range ballistic missile, or ballistic missile with a range over 1,000 kilometers. Medium range is no longer short range, it's medium range. So, besides its 1,300 kilometer range, the Shahab-3 can carry a warhead of 1,200 kilox, that is 1 ton, and 200 kilos of explosives with an accuracy of 2,500 meters. The Shahab-3. It was a project that didn't please the Ayatollahs very much, right? They weren't very pleased because its accuracy wasn't good. Yeah, really, it's a copy of a North Korean rocket, of a North Korean launcher, and that accuracy is very poor, right? 2,500 meters, which really can't hit a specific target. It can hit a city, right? If you want to hit city A or city B, you can this. But that building inside the city, you won't even come close to hitting it with a missile like that. Okay, so the Shahab-3, in fact, it had nuclear capabilities, right? Is that it? One of the first major Western and Israeli concerns with the Iranian missile program was the Shahab-3 because it had nuclear capabilities, since the North Korean missiles were built with that intention, right, to have nuclear capabilities. And finally, man, the Shahab-3, it was developed further to become a national version. It's from this North Korean medium-range missile, the Nodong-1, because remember, Nodong-1 North Korean, they made a national version. Now it's going to be improved in Iran and will become the GADR-110, okay? The GADR-110 is proof of the competence of Iranian engineering, right? Why? Because it's a medium-range missile that will extend the missile's range to 2,000 kilometers, right? It can already reach the entire Middle East, even the south of Europe, and it carries an 800-kilogram warhead, which is reduced, right? It lost 33% there, lost a third of its destructive power, but increased its range. So you have to understand this as a way for the Iranian regime to increase its attack range, not necessarily its destructive power. So, as I said, to increase the missile's range, its destructive power was reduced, right? However, that's what I would like to say and emphasize to you. The missile's accuracy, remember, it's called GADR 110. The missile's accuracy was increased to 110 meters. Imagine that, from over 2 kilometers to 110 meters, man. This time, you can actually hit an airbase, right? You can hit a depot there. You can hit a barracks, right? Maybe a building without air defense. But you can already hit with a much higher degree of precision, right? The GADR 110, and it achieves all this precision, especially because it's no longer a single stage, right? Now it has 2 stages. Its first stage is still liquid, but it has a second stage, which is solid. And this second stage, so it will add precision to the vehicle because it is activated right at the peak of the curve. And then the vehicle will be propelled downward with greater precision. And precisely because of the insertion of this extra fuel component there, for the second stage, you have to reduce the lethal payload, right? In other words, the missile's warhead, okay? Finally, the final evolution of the Shahabs, right? It's the EMAD. The EMAD is also a medium-range ballistic missile with a shorter range than the GADR 1,700 kilometer. It has an equivalent warhead of 750 kilograms, but man, with an accuracy of 50 meters. Look at that, 50. Now you hit the house, you hit the building you want, right? It's already a medium-range missile with very, very high accuracy, right? Very high. And EMAD is then the latest evolution, the most recent evolution of the Shahab family, which started, as I told you, back with the Scuds, which, by the way, the Scuds are direct descendants. Do you know of what? Of the German V2 from World War II. That's a topic for another time. Now let's move on to a second family of Iranian missiles, right? Which is the Fateh family. 110. What's the clear difference between these two families, Shahab and Fateh? The propulsion, okay, because the Fateh are already missiles with solid fuel engines. They don't need to be fueled in the field to be launched, right? That thing, fueling here, it will take about half an hour, maybe an hour, I don't know, just to fuel the missile so it can be launched. So the solid fuel missile is ready. It's ready to be used. You just turn it on and it goes, you know? It's stored at room temperature. It's ready to be used at any moment. So that's the advantage of solid fuel. It's ready right there. So it's like a firework rocket you buy at the store for the June festivals, right? So it's ready. You can store it in a little room in your house for months, and you just light it and it goes. So it's the same thing, okay? So the Fateh-110, which is a short-range missile, is a derivative of an unguided missile. An artillery rocket called Segil, an artillery rocket doesn't need to. It is fired, and it will also be fired in a ballistic trajectory, but a shallower one, and it will hit the target there, in a saturation of the battlefield, but not with precision. What did the Iranians do? They took this Segil missile, which was itself based on a Chinese missile. A Chinese artillery rocket, which itself was based on a Soviet artillery rocket. So they made their own national version of it. And to this short-range missile, they added guidance systems. It had a range of 300 kilometers with a 500-kilogram warhead and a very precise accuracy of 5 meters. Look, when I say 5 meters accuracy, a lot of people are going to say, oh, that's crazy, that its accuracy was much less than that. It was like, I don't know, 50, 100 meters, I don't know, man. The values given by the supplier and the values given by those who contest are different. I know that. I've researched it. However, since I don't have access to actual practical studies, of launching and observing the fall of these vehicles, here, what I can share with you are the supplier's values, the Iranian values. They say it's 5 meters, okay? So it's a rocket that has a range of 300 kilometers, and it has very good accuracy, 5 meters with solid fuel. They created an extended version of it with greater range, which is Fateh 313, which has a range of 500 kilometers, with a reduced warhead of 380 kilos. So once again, you sacrifice destructive power to increase the missile's range. You can see that they are not an evolution of each other. They are complementary. If you want to hit a closer target, you can use the Fateh-110, which has greater destructive power. But if your target is at a distance greater than 300 kilometers up to 500 kilometers, use the Fateh-313, which will have less destructive power. But you'll reach the target, which is even farther away, right? So the accuracy of both is very similar. About 5 meters, they're solid. They're externally very similar. And that's it. Those are the missiles that are being used against the Persian Gulf countries over there, right? Against Qatar, against Dubai, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, because the distances allow for that. Yeah? You just have to cross there, the Persian Gulf, the sea there, and you reach those targets that are right on the coast, right? The targets are on the coast and the missile accuracy is very high, so they can reach those targets, right? Those targets there quite often, right? Pretty much guaranteed they will hit the target. Then we have the Zulfiqar. It's an evolution of the Fateh, right? Now with a greater range, 700 kilometers, but also with a larger warhead, 500 kilograms. It's a bigger missile, actually. Its dimensions are larger, and the range, its accuracy because of that, has suffered, right? Its accuracy is lower. It's about 100 meters instead of 5 meters. So it gives a greater range, right? Bigger missiles give greater range, but they suffer in terms of accuracy. Why is that? Because the flight is longer, and this longer flight adds more difficulties in the final stage of the trajectory to be able to hit a specific target. So Zolfager is the first in a new line of bigger rockets, okay? But it's still considered short range because its range doesn't reach 1,000 kilometers, only 700, right? So what did the Iranians do then? They went on to build a medium-range rocket based on this short-range Zolfagar here. That's what they did. They built the Desful with a range of 1,000 kilometers, so it's already a medium-range missile with a 700-kilogram warhead. Obviously, it got even bigger, right? And this time with a precision of 5 meters, meaning it returned to its initial accuracy, right? So the Desful really is a significant technological step up compared to the Zolfagar. And then, again, another improvement, an upgrade called Haj Qasim, okay? In 2020, this missile, Haj Qasim, was launched, and maybe some of you have already noticed the name, right? Haj Qasim. Qasim, what is it? Qasim Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force, who was killed back in 2020, right? By the attack, I think it was American, Israeli. And then he received this posthumous tribute with the name of the next missile, which was the Haj Qasim, which is also a medium-range missile with a range of 1,400 kilometers. And this missile also had a reduced warhead, 500 kilograms to reach further, and the accuracy suffered a bit, around 100 meters, this rocket. It featured a structural innovation compared to the Dasful. It's not the Dasful. Sorry, which is the fact that it uses 2 stages. Okay, so 2 stages made it reach farther. With the sacrifice of the warhead payload, which was reduced to 500 kilos instead of the other one's 700. But the accuracy also wasn't very high. Okay, and to increase this accuracy, so the Haj Qasim was improved, and then the Qasim Basir was created. The Qasim Basir was launched a few years later with a slightly reduced range of 1,200 kilometers and the same 500 kilogram payload. However, its accuracy, its onboard electronics, are much more advanced than its predecessor. And now, with an accuracy of 5 meters, that's an accuracy of 5 meters. And some people, there are people who even say 3 meters. I've seen sources mention up to 3 meters. But it's the pinnacle of this Fateh missile family, right? Which are evolutions of artillery missiles, right? Iranian artillery rockets. So we've reached the end of the second family of Iranian missiles. Now we have to analyze 3 projects, which are projects that evolve from the knowledge generated in these 2 families. There you go. And the first of them, the 3 I'm going to talk about now, are medium-range missiles. But the first one is the Khorramshahr Shakan. Okay, the Khorramshahr Shakan. It is a general structural improvement compared to its relatives from the other 2 families, right? It will use solid fuel, a single stage, but it will have a design, much lighter, more compact and lighter. It will be a smaller missile, which will offer similar range, accuracy, and payloads, but it will be smaller and lighter than its predecessors. Therefore, it will be easier to store. It's a better missile in every way, right? It's a better missile in every case. So Khorramshahr Shakan has a range of 1,450 kilometers. Look, up to this point, it has a better range than any of the missiles in the family. Fateh then, 1,450 kilometers, carrying a payload of 550 kilos with an accuracy of 100 meters. Its accuracy isn't as good as Qasim Basir's, but it's lighter and easier to store. It's a more practical missile, right? But then they had to improve the accuracy issue. And that's when the Segil missile was created. And the Segil It already has an even greater range, 2,000 kilometers with a 700-kilogram warhead. 2,000 kilometers with a 700-kilogram warhead. You can see that it's the most advanced missile up to now. And the secrecy, it also had an impact on study groups, on specialized Western defense magazines. Why? Because the Segil doesn't resemble North Korean, Chinese, or Russian projects. For the first time, Western analysts realized that the Iranians had built their own design, 100% national, without foreign influence. Where did this missile come from? I don't know. It came 100% from Iranian mines. That's it. So this missile, besides reaching 2,000 kilometers and having a warhead of 700 kilos, it has an accuracy of 50 meters. Man, 50 meters at 2,000 kilometers. That's good accuracy, isn't it? And for that, it uses two solid stages, right? Two solid stages. You can clearly see there that it uses that technology developed nationally with the Gadra 110 and also the Hash Qasem, which use two stages, right? They're two-stage missiles. And finally, we have one last big missile, which is the Khorramshahr. And the Khorramshahr is a missile that reaches 2,000 kilometers, but it has a massive warhead of 1 ton and 800 kilos, right? 800 kilos. When I say massive warhead, guys, it's because compared to the others, it's much bigger, right? So it's the largest warhead of an Iranian missile up to now, a warhead. It has lower accuracy, about 100 meters, but it reaches the 2,000 kilometers range. It doubles, right? It more than doubles the explosive payload, but its accuracy is lower. It's about 100 meters. The higher accuracy is actually lower, about 100 meters. Okay, it has about 50% of the accuracy compared to the Segil, but it delivers more than 50% of the warhead, okay? The Khorramshahr is a domestic version of the Hwasong-10, a North Korean missile, Hwasong-10. And looking here, we can clearly see that in the timeline of the evolution of Iranian missiles, they take a foreign project, and the foreign project adds new capabilities that they didn't have. However, they end up struggling in one of the aspects, notably accuracy. North Korean missiles are less accurate. Then there's a second generation, which we don't have yet, because the Khorramshahr is the latest one in use so far, right? It will address this problem and probably a next generation of the Khorramshahr, if it exists, will reduce, right, the accuracy problem. It will increase the accuracy to 50 or even less meters, carrying a warhead of almost 2 tons for 2,000 kilometers, right? Finally, at the very end, now we have to talk about the Fatah missile, Fatah-One, right? Because the Fatah-2 is still in development. The Fatah-One is a medium-range ballistic missile with a range of 1,400 kilometers and a warhead of 450 kilograms. It's a pretty small warhead compared to average, right? But its body is really designed for high final speed, right? Because it's a missile that the Iranians consider hypersonic, capable of reaching Mach 15, which is 15 times the speed of sound. Some Western analysts say no, that it doesn't have all that performance. No. But again, I can't judge that here because I don't have access to technical studies about this vehicle, right? But 1,400 kilometers at 450 kilos with a precision of 25 meters, that's good accuracy. 25 meters at 1,400 kilometers is good accuracy. So Fatah-One is a different beast, right? It's a separate family with this hypersonic capability. So the Fatah-2 would be a much bigger evolution compared to the Fatah-One, but it still hasn't reached operational status. Over in Iran, some of those missiles, especially the bigger ones, right, they're considered missiles with nuclear capabilities. And although Iran up to now hasn't achieved nuclear capabilities, some missiles in their arsenal have the capacity to carry warheads, even if they're miniaturized warheads, right? In other words, they wouldn't be first-generation warheads like most countries that have nuclear weapons today once had, okay? And if you like this topic, if you're into military history and want to learn more about this fascinating subject, I have my book here, which is an excellent way for you to expand your knowledge. Check out The Atom as a Weapon, a brief history of the creation and use of atomic bombs in World War II. If you want to know more about this event, which is, quite complicated in itself because it involves physics and various precise and exact sciences, but in an understandable, accessible, and educational way, this book here is an excellent way for you to start your studies. It's for sale at the WeClap store through the link in the description and also by the QR code on the screen. And if you want your copy signed by me with a dedication for you, just send an email to Saladagera Edgemail with your Zone Improvement Plan code so I can calculate the shipping cost.